Hello and welcome to another episode of the Dongfang Hour China Space News Roundup. This for the week of the 2nd to 8th of August, 2021. I'm Blaine Curcio, joined as always by my co-host Jean Deville, and this week I'm joining you from the Hong Kong Infection Control Center due to my having tested preliminarily positive for COVID-19 on arrival at Hong Kong Airport yesterday. So we will keep you all up to date, but at the moment I'm being held here until they can confirm that positive test or otherwise have a negative test. Before getting into this week's news updates, first a special shout out to our good friends at spacewatch.global and Go Taikonauts, two excellent sources of space industry news, and a kind reminder that in addition to the few stories we will discuss this week, we have a few more stories in our Dongfang Hour newsletter, so do subscribe to that if you have not done so already. This week, we bring you some updates on iSpace's launch attempt, a couple of other launch-related updates, but first, some news on a SAR constellation and what we could call the SAR Wars, which is to say the SAR topic is getting very, very hot in China these days.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are honored to welcome you aboard the Dongfang Hour. Please make sure your seatbelt is securely fastened. Thank you.
女士们、先生们，预计空中飞行时间2小时15分钟，我们预计在当地时间下午6点25分左右到达。
So let's start indeed with SAR Wars. So SAR as in synthetic aperture radar satellites. On July the 26th, we saw that Chinese remote sensing data analytics company Iceye had signed a strategic cooperation agreement with Galaxy Space, which is a fellow Chinese commercial company specializing in the manufacture of satellites, notably communication satellites, as well as also some downstream applications and services. The agreement that was unveiled between Galaxy Space and Iceye focuses on the establishment of a commercial SAR constellation, with Galaxy Space, according to the agreement, taking the lead in terms of satellite manufacturing, so basically providing the hardware, while Iceye would focus on the downstream applications. The collaboration agreement also covers things like ground segments, so basically sending the data from the satellite to the ground. It covers TT&C, so telemetry, tracking, and control. It covers also things like, so quoting them here, integrated remote sensing and communication satellite technology. It's not very clear what exactly this refers to, but it's not entirely unfamiliar considering that we also have another Chinese constellation called Qiansheng-1 and Qiansheng-2 still to be deployed. That's by Qiansheng Exploration. And this constellation is an Earth observation constellation that has a narrowband communications component to it as a secondary payload. So it could be the same here for the SAR constellation planned by Iceye and Galaxy Space. Now, from a higher level standpoint, there seems to be a gold rush right now for commercial SAR satellites recently, and this trend is global. We've probably all heard of constellations outside of China like Iceye or Capella space, and this has also been picking up momentum in China as well. And this is because naturally SAR data is extremely useful. A really great example of that is the great use that SAR data was put to during the Henan flooding a couple of weeks ago. And the reason for this gold rush for SAR is also because I think, Chinese SAR capabilities over the country are quite scarce still today. If we put aside, of course, the Yaogan, the military series. And a great example of that is, again, the Henan flooding, where all the data analytics companies literally were using SAR data, and all their SAR data was coming from one single satellite, which was the Gaofen 3. And so the Gaofen 3 is China's first civilian SAR satellite. It was launched in 2016, and it's, the satellite that everyone is relying on. I think the only other SAR satellite that was sort of involved in the emergency operations during the Henan flooding was SpaceD's Hyperbola-1 SAR small satellite that was launched in December 2020. And despite having limited capabilities in SAR today, and sort of hinting at my earlier point, we have many commercial SAR constellations and projects that are coming up that are sprouting literally to sort of fill the void that we have currently in China. And this could potentially lead to what Blaine referred to as the Chinese SAR Wars, due to the associated possible overcapacity in a couple of years. And so among the SAR projects that we've heard of, let's give a few examples here. We have the so-called mini SAR satellite series from SpaceD, probably the most advanced commercial SAR product at the moment. They already have one such satellite in orbit, as mentioned. It's the Iceye-1 that was launched in December 2020. And so that's probably the first one, the main one. But we also have Minospace, which seems to have developed a SAR variant of their MN200 platform. We also have the Shandong Institute of Industrial Technology that launched the Qilu-1 SAR satellite in April 2021, so a couple of months ago. And we know that there are other companies that have on a regular basis expressed interest in having their own SAR capabilities. And so these include Chinese companies like Foursquare's Technology, China RS, Zhuhai Orbiter, and Beijing Smart Satellite. So this leads to this fantastic expression of SAR Wars, Blaine.
SAR Wars indeed. Yeah, looking forward to seeing the Chinese spin on Chewbacca. That will be interesting. And also to your point about Tiansheng and I guess other kind of integrated EO and communications constellations, this is certainly something that we've seen more broadly by China in the sense that we've heard quite a lot about the Tongdaoyao Yitihua, the sort of the communication, the integration of communication, SatNav, and EO in these constellations. So definitely a topic to keep an eye on, sort of on the periphery. This integration of communication and EO. So just a couple of small points to add to the PiSat and Galaxy Space announcement more specifically. So I would first point out that PiSat had previously announced a 4-satellite SAR constellation with a cost of around 240 million RMB, and with the prime contractor for that constellation being CASC. And so it's not entirely clear, but it seems likely that this constellation is that constellation. And despite the announcement with Galaxy Space this week, which is significant, and I'll get to that in a moment, we did also see a recent contract from about a week and a half ago for about 215 million RMB awarded by PiSat to CASC. And so probably CASC will be the prime manufacturer and Galaxy Space will offer a supporting role. I would also point out that the CASC contract mentions 24-month construction time for the constellation. I think another relevant player in this constellation is the CAS Aerospace Information Research Institutes, the 中国科学院空天信息创新研究院, aka the 空天院. This is an institute of the Chinese Academy of Sciences that's known for its ability in SAR payloads and SAR data processing. So I guess probably what we're seeing is potentially Galaxy Space providing the satellite bus or some other rather less highly specialized part of this project. And then we have the CAS Aerospace Information Research Institute providing some of the SAR technology, and then CASC probably being the integrator potentially, and also maybe providing some SAR technology. So overall, definitely an interesting constellation involving what is basically an all-star team of players. So PiSat is arguably China's leading Earth observation data analytics company. They successfully IPO'd on the Starboard in 2019, and they are currently sitting on a market capitalization of about 7.5 billion RMB, so about 1.2 billion US dollars. And I would also point out that the market appears to like the news about this constellation, as PiSat's share price has gone up about 15% in the past 5 trading days. So then looking at Galaxy Space specifically and their role in this project, I think that this is probably the most interesting company involved in the project. I mean, CAST and the CAS are both very much usual suspects as it relates to satellite manufacturing and SAR. Galaxy Space less so. So the company has an interesting history, having initially been very much hell-bent on launching their own broadband satellite constellation, aiming for tens of thousands of satellites to provide primarily sort of 5G connectivity is the way they would have branded that. They have since pivoted significantly to being more of a pure play satellite manufacturer and to some extent developing some applications. And this is where I think it gets quite interesting. With Galaxy Space having won this deal to have some role in manufacturing SAR EO satellites, it is some degree of validation for their ability to manufacture satellites, while at the same time being a little bit unusual in that it is Earth observation. And again, up to this point, Galaxy Space has pretty much been focused on telecommunications satellites. So this is, again, a pretty interesting development, with Galaxy Space apparently branching out a little bit to do manufacturing of Earth observation satellites. So I guess this is kind of surprising as well, given the fact there are several other Chinese commercial satellite manufacturers that have put more emphasis on SAR for a longer period of time. So this would be companies like Minospace or ComSat or SpaceD. And so probably we can assume one of two things as it relates to Galaxy Space's involvement specifically as a commercial satellite manufacturer. So the first could be that Galaxy Space offered a sort of a better turnkey package. So not just the satellite, but some TT&C assistance or otherwise some application development, this type of thing. Or two, that Galaxy Space offered some funding or some other equity in return for getting this deal. So they are basically more of a partner than a supplier in that case. And if I were to speculate, I would say the latter is more likely. The Galaxy Space has either put up some money or some equity or some other financial element as part of this deal. And again, being then more of a partner than a supplier. And this is, I think, made more likely by the fact that Galaxy Space is known to be quite rich. They are the only, as far as I know, unicorn in the Chinese commercial space sector, having achieved a valuation of more than $1 billion at their last funding round in late 2020. And so again, I think if I had to guess, I would say that the involvement of Galaxy Space as the commercial satellite manufacturer is more of a reflection of their financial prowess or their willingness to put up some capital than it is about necessarily their SAR capabilities, because there are a couple of other commercial satellite manufacturers that seem to have more advanced, specifically SAR capabilities. So yeah, anything else, John, from your side on the SAR Wars, or shall we move into the iSpace Hyperbola-1 launch?
Yeah, I'm good. Let's move to iSpace and the Hyperbola-1. So Chinese commercial launch company iSpace, also known as Interstellar Glory, attempted to launch its solid-fueled small-lift rocket called the Hyperbola-1, and this was on August the 3rd. And the Hyperbola-1 is notable for being the first Chinese commercial company to ever have successfully reached orbit. That was in July 2019. But unfortunately for iSpace, this time, the launch ended up in failure, which according to the press release was due to the unsuccessful payload fairing separation that took place in the final stages, basically, of the launch. It's worth noting also that the press release, while announcing this failure of the Hyperbola-1 that was launched a couple of days ago, did adopt a sort of a positive stance. It notes that notably, while the 4 rocket stages separated successfully during the launch, the attitude and orbital control engines worked correctly, the GNC, so the guidance, navigation, and control, was nominal. We also had successful payload separation. So payload separation being the satellite separating itself from the rocket. And so the only issue, basically, but of course a fatal issue, was the payload fairing separation. And so basically this press release formulates this launch attempt as a failure, but also as a near success that has contributed in collecting a lot of very precious and useful flight data. This is the second launch failure in a row for iSpace. It also failed another launch of the Hyperbola-1, and that was in February 2021, so just a couple of months ago. And this is out of a total of 3 Hyperbola-1 launches. So that's a failure rate of about 66%. And I think right now it's still unclear to what extent this additional failure will affect iSpace, because iSpace is really one of the best funded and one of the most advanced commercial launch companies in China. It has very big plans, very ambitious plans. It has, for example, the reusable medium lift liquid fueled Hyperbola-2 that should perform some first hops by the end of this year. And they also have a Hyperbola-3. So we're talking about a Falcon 9 class or Falcon Heavy class rocket that just passed the definition phase this year and that has entered the R&D phase. So a company with big plans. And I also want to mention that iSpace is not the only company that has encountered launch failures over the past couple of months and years. And some examples is OneSpace and LandSpace that both experienced one failure each. And we also had Expace with 2 failures of their Kuaizhou series of rockets. So yeah, space is hard and everyone is having these problems. I think the main issue for iSpace as one of the leading commercial launch companies is that we have a lot of other launch companies and they are not far behind and they are all closing in. And so just to give a few examples of that, we have Galactic Energy that successfully launched this Series 1, also a small lift solid fueled rocket. And that was at the end of last year. And this year, they also plan to perform 2 more Series 1 launches. And so if these 2 succeed, then they will potentially play the reliability card, saying, hey, out of this class of solid fuel rockets, we're at 3 out of 3. Hyperbola-1 is 1 out of 3. So that's a major advantage for them. And we have another company called CASC, which previously mentioned that they would have the maiden launch of their ZK-1 rocket in September 2021. So in a couple of weeks, basically. And we also have a lot of other rocket companies that have big plans for their medium lift liquid fueled rockets. And just to list a few here, once again, Landspace with their ZQ-2 by the end of this year with their maiden launch. We have Blue Aerospace with the Tianlong-1 also by the end of this year, according to what they mentioned previously. We have Galactic Energy with the Pallas-1 next year, and we have Blue Aerospace with the Nebula-2 also potentially next year. So, and that's just the tip of the iceberg. So really, I think it'll be interesting to see how iSpace tries to get out of this sticky situation. I guess that the success of the hops and the maiden launch of the Hyperbola-2 will play a major role. So let's see how in 1 year or two, how the dust settles down and which rocket manufacturer is really able to produce an operational, a reliable, and a cost-efficient launch vehicle.
Indeed, and at least the ZQ-2 over here, we'd call it the ZQ-2, I suppose, but that's neither here nor there. So definitely a tough break for iSpace, and I do kind of have to wonder: is it rather overly ambitious to be developing 3 distinct rockets at the same time, and is that contributing to the apparently relatively low success rate in what is admittedly a small sample size? But either way, space is hard. So getting back to the launch, so not a lot to add to the existing analysis, though a couple of small points. So first, our sources in China tell us that the satellite on this ill-fated Hyperbola rocket was an Earth observation satellite to be operated by CGSTL. And the CGSTL is a Earth observation satellite manufacturer and constellation operator, as we've discussed before, with some very ambitious plans, including expanding its current Jilin-1 constellation of 25 satellites to 60 satellites by year end, and to 138 satellites by the end of 2025. So again, it seems that the satellite on this rocket was a CGSTL satellite. So the next point is that the launch failure is yet another example of the growing pains that China's commercial space industry continues to go through, and that Jean alluded to earlier. And just to dig a little bit more into this, we've heard multiple times from satellite manufacturers and from aspiring constellation operators that the main one of the main bottlenecks for their deployment of their constellations is the launch side of the industry. Specifically, there is simply not enough launch vehicle capacity. And this makes some degree of sense, and it is exacerbated by the fact that most CASC launches are either spoken for by missions that are either very large, so like no extra space, or very sensitive and critical. So even if there was extra space, they're not going to risk the mission just to add a 50-kilogram commercial satellite that's going to be the 6th payload. So basically, despite the fact that CASC this year, as we've heard, 40-plus launches planned, there's really not that much launch space on the traditional CASC rockets at the moment for commercial companies. And so as such, many Chinese commercial satellite manufacturers are awaiting a more regular commercial launch cadence, which is something that we've heard about as on the way for some time. And as Jean mentioned, there are a plethora of commercial companies working very hard to develop rockets now. So the iSpace setback, while not ideal, is probably not the end of the world as it relates to Chinese commercial launch. And so, in fact, just this week, we received some other updates from some other commercial launch companies that are quite a bit more promising. And that segue being the case, Sean, anything on your side about these other commercial launch companies?
Absolutely. There's a big update from Blue Aerospace. Over the past week, we saw that Blue Aerospace, so another Chinese commercial launch company, performed the first hop of their Nebula-M, which is a vertical takeoff, vertical landing demonstrator that we sort of mentioned also in past episodes in recent times. And so this was their very first hop. The highest point of the hop was around 10 meters. And this test had the objective of verifying 3 performance points. And so the first one was the thrust adjustments during the hop, which went from 60% thrust to 100%. And this throttling was enabled by controlling the power of the electrical pumps of the Leighton 5 Carolox engine that equips this small demonstrator. The second point to verify was the guidance and control algorithms, which enable the stability of the rocket. So basically controlling things like, the speed, the pitch, the yaw of the rocket. And these, according to the press release, performed nominally. And finally, the last thing that was to be tested during the launch was the rocket's landing struts in operational conditions. And so these must act as a shock absorber as the rocket lands and adapt to the different impact speeds and also the tilt that the rocket may have when it is entering contact with the ground. And so it must also resist the massive and the very intense thermal environment that is caused by the exhaust of the rocket's engine. Now, this is big or small news, depending on which angle you use to look at it. So for the Chinese commercial space industry, I think this is undeniably big news. It is Deep Blue Aerospace's very first hop, so this is a very important milestone on its way to developing vertical takeoff, vertical landing technology. And it is the second only Chinese company ever to have performed this, the other one being Lynxpace with their RLV demonstrator series. And it also suggests that China's launch sector is getting closer and closer to developing a reusable launch vehicle with a similar flight profile as the SpaceX Falcon 9. Now, this also could be considered as a very small step in the sense that just so much remains to be done by Deep Blue Aerospace before it actually produces an operational rocket. The Nebula-M, as mentioned in past episodes of Dongfang Hour, is a teeny tiny rocket. It's a single engine rocket. It's barely 7.3 meters tall. Really, the sole purpose is demonstrating the low altitude hops that it has started performing. And the single engine it's equipped with, the Leighton 5, is I think a 50 kilonewton class Carolox engine, which will definitely not be the engine that will be used on the on the main stage of the Nebula 2 operational rocket. So really, it's a pure demonstrator. And while DBA, so Deep Blue Aerospace, also attempted a comparison of its hop with SpaceX's Starship, as well as the early Falcon 9 prototypes, the Grasshopper, basically, which was a Falcon 9 first stage demonstrator. We're talking here with Deep Blue Aerospace about a much more simple technology demonstrator, the Nebula-M. And so there is still a lot of work to do for DBA. Now, of course, not to take away the credit from them, really congrats to the DBA team for a successful first hop. This is a very important milestone. It's good work, and hopefully they can also succeed in more ambitious hops with higher altitude, certainly in the weeks and months to come. So, Blaine, anything else you want to tell us about launch? I think there's also some news coming from central China.
Indeed, yeah. And before getting into that, Lynxpace, what a blast from the past. I feel like we have not heard from them in a very long time. But indeed, they did succeed in that hop quite a little while ago, I think. So we'll see. To central China and another commercial launch company. This week, we saw CASC commercial launch subsidiary Expace announce that they had completed assembly of both a Kuaizhou 1A and a Kuaizhou 11 rocket. And so just to review a little bit, Expace is one of China's leading commercial launch companies, having completed 9 successful launches of the Kuaizhou 1A in the several years leading up to mid-2020. And the company has, they've received significant support from CASC. It is basically a subsidiary of the large CASC subsidiary Sanjiang Group. And they have used that support to basically become arguably the leading commercial launch company in China. More recently, however, Expace has faced some challenges, namely the failure in the inaugural launch of their Kuaizhou 11 in July of 2020, and then a second failure on the 10th launch of the Kuaizhou 1A in September of 2020. And since those two failures, so almost going on 1 year, we've heard very few updates from Expace, and the lack of the Kuaizhou 11 in China's launch manifest is certainly a contributor to the bottleneck that I mentioned earlier for the launch of various commercial satellite programs. And this would include most notably CGSTL and probably also Xingyun, which is a constellation that is being developed by CASC and that would presumably be launched primarily using Expace rockets. So moving forward, I think the completion of the assembly of these two rockets and also just the public announcement of such may indicate that we're getting close to a return to launch for one or both of these rockets. And so just a final point on Expace. This news is but the latest from the company's Wuhan Aerospace Industrial Base, which is a massive project that calls for a rocket factory, satellite factory, and various supporting industries. So the base has seen some fits and starts, notably multiple Kuaizhou failures and some questionable progress by Hongyun and Xingyun. We have seen in recent months several significant updates. And so the aforementioned satellite factory was completed in January of 2021 and produced its first satellite in May of 2021, an event that we covered in the Dongfang Hour newsletter, issue number 2. And so moving forward, a return to flight of the Kuaizhou 11 and the Kuaizhou 1A could be a catalyst for a large increase in the number of satellites launched by CASC, because again, you have these couple of different constellation plans that are presumably planning to be launched on CASC rockets, and you can't do that without CASC rockets launching. So again, a little bit of speculation. It's not entirely clear how soon these rockets are going to return to flight. But having not heard anything from Expace about these rockets for almost a year, it is probably noteworthy that they are publicly saying they've completed the assembly of these rockets and that it's all is well. So definitely a lot of going on in the commercial launch sector in China. Jean, anything else from your side on Expace or any of these other updates?
I'm good for this week.
Excellent. Well, I am certainly good for this week because I'm sitting in my hospital bed. This has been another episode of the Dongfang Hour China Space News Roundup, this for the week of the 2nd to 8th of August, 2021. I'm Blaine Curcio, joined as always by my co-host Jean Deville, and if I'm still in the same spot next week, then we've got some problems. So let's hope that I'm not still sitting in the hospital about a week and a half from now. And until then, stay well, and we will see you next time.
Thank you for watching. See you next week.